ThinkTech Hawaii. Civil engagement lives here.
Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of Likable Science here on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Ethan Allen. Likable Science is all about how science is a vital and interesting part of everyone's life, day in and day out. We can't get away from it. You should embrace it, enjoy it, thrive with it. With me here today in the ThinkTech studios is Chris Sabine. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
Chris is a new oceanography faculty at the UH Manawa here, and comes to us from Seattle, where he was with NOAA. Well, in Seattle, it was deeply involved in the issue of plastics in the ocean, and that's a big issue out here in Hawaii. Everyone knows about the plastics in the ocean. We're sort of, I guess, on the edge of the Great Pacific Garbage Gyre, right? Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about the scope of this problem and the scale. How much plastic is there in the ocean? Do we have any idea?
We don't have a great idea. We're just starting to make some measurements, and it's variable. The concentrations are variable all over the oceans. Mm-hmm. But the estimates range from somewhere around 200,000 to maybe 500,000 metric tons of plastic in the oceans.
That's a lot.
And it's growing quickly.
Yeah, that's the thing. If you see the curve on how much plastics are dumped in the ocean, it's rising sort of geometrically now, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. And that comes from the fact that we're producing plastic at an ever-increasing rate.
Right, more and more. Yeah.
Yeah. So for the last 50 years, we've increased the production of plastics globally by about 20-fold. So when I was born in the mid-1960s, we were producing about 15 million tons of plastic a year globally, and today we're producing over 315 million metric tons of plastic. It's growing geometrically.
And most of that plastic, well, a lot of that plastic gets used once and then is discarded.
In the United States, on average, we recycle about 7% of the plastic that we use. Most of it is throwaway.
Yeah.
And a big part of that is plastic water bottles. Mm-hmm. That's really grown in the past few years. You know, you see them everywhere now, right?
Exactly. You can't get away from them. And
right.
They're terribly wasteful. I mean.
Right. So in the United States, we consume 91 billion water bottles a year, and only 1 in 5 of those is ever recycled. Globally, it's more like 560 billion water bottles a year, and most of those get put into landfills, or they end up in the ocean, or wherever. Only very few get recycled, so they have to make new water bottles every time. Wow. And it's just growing out of control.
Yeah, and it's you know, sort of this hideous monster that sort of has appeared. Right? We thought plastics were being good, right? From the movie The Graduate, right?
Right.
You know, he's talking in the late '60s here about plastics is the big new thing. You know,
exactly.
Because they were really up and booming then as an industry, and it was going to save our lives.
Yeah, they're cheap to manufacture. They're sturdy.
Right.
They, don't break down. They're waterproof. But that's the problem.
Right.
When they get into the ocean, they don't break down.
Right. So it's sort of actually, it reminds me of a strange little animal story I read. A little campfire story for those of you who know how I do these. There's a newt called the Iberian newt, a little salamander kind of thing that lives on the Spanish peninsula there. It looks like a perfectly normal little gray newt, nothing, except when it gets attacked, it then literally it swings its ribs, cages out, literally breaking through its skin, ripping it and getting coated with poisons from its skin in the process, and of course then being a ugly mouthful for any predator. And so it's sort of this hidden thing within it. I don't know how it puts itself back together. That I didn't read about. I got to check this out. But sort of like so plastics have this sort of dark side to them, right? That we often don't think of. We think of them as very convenient. They're lightweight. They're durable. They're You can mold them in any shape you want. They're inexpensive.
Right. And and I guess, like your newt, I don't know how he recovers from that, but it's probably not something that he
does lightly.
right? And so we kind of jumped right into these plastic things. They seem like the perfect solution, just like you mentioned in The Graduate. This is the perfect thing.
Right.
But we hadn't really thought about that dark side and the consequences of what happens to all that plastic once we produce it.
Right. I mean, they're a great example, I guess, of needing to be very aware of the life cycle of a product, right?
Right.
It's not enough to make the product and get it out and get the consumer using it, but then what happens to it after that?
Right.
Where does it go? Because everything's got to go somewhere, right?
That's right. And unfortunately, a significant fraction, about 7% of what we produce every year ends up in the oceans.
Yeah.
And there can be disastrous for marine ecosystems and all sorts of other problems.
Right, and sort of on every level it can hit, right? Because there are big things of plastic, the nets and large plastic containers and plastic shelving and things that can cause trouble, all the way down to little tiny particles that are being ingested by marine life that probably aren't very good for them.
Right, right. Yeah, no, it's the full range. And, there are some interesting stories, for example, about 20 or 30 years ago, there was a great study on ocean circulation. So there are these currents that move water around in the ocean that, are difficult to study sometimes. And I guess there was a container full of little rubber duckies that got in a storm and fell off the ship, and all the rubber duckies escaped. And the scientists actually used the movement of those rubber duckies as they moved around the oceans to understand ocean currents.
I remember reading about that, yeah.
So at the time, it was like, oh, wow, this is great. And in fact, back in the day, NOAA used to put out these little plastic drift cards, kind of taking the lesson from the rubber duckies. The issue with the duckies was they are blown by the wind, but they made these little drift cards, they call them. They were orange, bright orange, and they had stamped into them in the address. And, if you found them, and a number, and if you found them, you're supposed to call the government and tell them where you found it and give them the number. And from that, again, they could track all the currents. Well, that was, again, it seemed like a great thing at the time, but we didn't really necessarily think through. That was before my day. I didn't do that, by the way. But we didn't really think through the consequences of what does that mean, putting all that plastic in the ocean?
So some of those cards are presumably drifting around to this day, right?
Exactly. So we don't do that anymore.
Right, yeah. And it comes in all forms, too. I mean, the other thing is the little, in all the facial products and exfoliants now, the little plastic microbeads, right, that we are putting like 7 trillion per day into the waterways in this country or something. Yeah,
so there are multiple issues with plastics that we can talk about. One of the things that we're particularly concerned about now are these microbeads. It's bad enough that we're putting plastics that we unintentionally put into the waterways and the oceans. But these things are manufactured specifically to be washed down the sink and out into the ocean. And the issue with it is they're a few millimeters in diameter. They're all perfectly round. This is in a facial scrub or in toothpaste or whatever cosmetic. When they get washed off, they go right through the treatment plants out into the oceans, and they look just like fish eggs. So what happens is, as they're going through our waterways in the treatment plants, they're picking up all kinds of horrible chemicals, all the hormones and medicines and all that stuff that we dump down into the sewage plants, and then they absorb that, and then when they go out into the ocean, they look just like fish eggs, so the fish eat them, and then those chemicals get desorbed and they end up in the tissues of the fish.
Oh, okay.
And that's a challenge.
Even if the plastic itself may not be particularly harmful to the fish, although certainly it's not good for some animals, we know, but the stuff it's carrying on its surface may end up being very harmful.
Exactly, and that can go on up the food chain all the way up to us. So there really is a potential for affecting human health. It affects the fish too, just the plastic itself, because a lot of fish, again, they eat these little tiny plastics and think of them as food, but they can't really pass the plastics. They can't digest them and they can't pass them. So they end up sitting there in the guts, and there's evidence that some fish, and in particular marine birds, will eat so many pieces of plastic that it displaces the room that they would need to eat real food and get their nutrition, and they can literally starve to death because their stomachs are just full of plastic.
Right, on the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, I'll see baby albatrosses that are basically, the crops are completely filled with plastic gobs instead of,
Exactly. A study that I heard found that their record was 276 pieces of plastic in one 90-day-old chick.
Wow.
So in 90 days, it had completely filled up its stomach with plastic debris.
So it's no good, and then it can do all kinds of other harm can be done to bigger animals. So you got into this through your NOAA work, right? You really got involved in it.
Right. So I'm a brand new faculty here.
Right.
Just started, and I'm typically a climate scientist by training. I study ocean acidification and various chemistry in the ocean. But in my NOAA position, I was the director of a NOAA laboratory in Seattle. And as such, I was responsible for a whole range of things, one of which was a marine debris program where, in particular, a lot of NOAA's marine debris efforts have been focused on cleaning up derelict fishing gear. So near the shore, near the land, a lot of the plastics that we're seeing are, in fact, coming from land. There's stuff that blows off into the ocean or whatever. But as you get in more remote areas, most of the debris that we're finding is fishing gear that was actually put into the ocean on purpose, but it got broken or somehow got away from the fishermen. I don't think they mean to leave it there, but it gets left, and those are particularly a problem because, for example, these ghost nets, they can sink to the bottom and destroy the marine habitat, the benthic environment. They also continue to kill even when they're on the reefs. So the fish come in and they get trapped in the net, and then they die, and the dead fish then attracts more fish, which come in and they get trapped, and it's just this killing machine they continually go through. So NOAA has really focused on cleaning up these nets, and in particular, one of the great programs is conducted by the Marine Debris Program at the Pacific Island Fishery Science Center, which is just out here on Ford Island. And they've been since the early 2000s going up into the northwestern Hawaiian Islands on a ship to recover particularly fishing gear from these islands. And there's a video that I brought that kind of illustrates some of the issues.
Why don't we pop that video right up right now here?
Sure. So again, it's not just fish that are trapped, but also marine mammals and other...
and a sea turtle.
Sea turtles. And so this is an example of a turtle that got trapped in a net that had drifted up onto the reef and got trapped there. And luckily it was shallow enough that the turtle was still able to bob up to the surface and get air.
Right.
But, given enough time, he would have starved to death.
Right.
And so the NOAA people happened to see this, and they jumped right in to cut this turtle free. And again, it's just an example of some of the things we see monk seals all the time that are trapped. In fact, we feel that the population of monk seals in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands was significantly improved by this program to go and recover the marine debris because it was killing so many of the young pups that don't know better.
Yeah, amazing. But I hate to cut you off, but we're being told we need to drop out to a break here. Christopher Sabine from UH Manoa, formerly of NOAA. We're talking about the plastics in the ocean, and I'm your host, Ethan Allen, here on ThinkTech Hawaii. We'll be right back in 1 minute.
Aloha, I'm Keli'i Akina, and I'm here every other week on Mondays at 2 o'clock p.m. on ThinkTech Hawaii's Hawaii Together. In Hawaii Together, we talk with some of the most fascinating people in the islands about working together for a better economy, government, and society. So I invite you into our conversation every other Monday at 2 p.m. on ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. Join us for Hawaii Together. I'm Kili'i Akina. Aloha.
Aloha. My name is Mark Shklav. I am the host of ThinkTech Hawaii's Law Across the Sea. Law Across the Sea comes on every other Monday at 11 a.m. Please join us. I like to bring in guests that talk about all types of things that come across the sea to Hawaii. Not just law, love, people, ideas, history. Please join us for Law Across the Sea. Aloha.
And you're back here with me, your host, Ethan Allen, on Likable Science on ThinkTech Hawaii. Dr. Chris Sabine is with me today here in the studio, and we're talking about the plastics in the ocean. And we were just watching this dramatic film right before the break of a couple of NOAA scientists in a marine debris removal program coming upon a sea turtle who is entangled in a net, and they rescued him and cut the turtle free, which is great. So they literally, I guess they go out and they just start loading, they haul this stuff up and just load it on a ship until they can't sort of put any more on safely. And
Exactly.
And they haul tons and tons and tons of this debris away each year, right?
Exactly. Well, so they started, when they first started this program in the early 2000s, they were going out every year and they were collecting up to 100 tons of debris a year. And now, due to funding cuts, they're dropping down to every 3 years that they go out. In fact, this is the third year, so they're going out in September to do another expedition to collect more debris. But it's estimated that that marine debris is accumulating at a rate of about 50 tons per year in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And the reason for that is the large-scale ocean circulation. You know, it moves the trash around the North Pacific gyre, right? So there's a big gyre in the lower latitudes. You have the trade winds that push water from east to west, and then in the northern part of the Pacific, you have the westerlies that are pushing water from the west to the east. Because we're on a spinning planet, those waters rotate to the right, and it ends up creating this circular pattern, this kind of whirlpool in the throughout the Pacific, and that moves all the debris around in a circle. And you can think of the Hawaiian Islands like a comb, you know, the island sticking up. And so the debris is floating around in this circle, like going around the bathtub drain, you know, and this comb is just catching all that debris, about 50 tons a year. And particularly the fishing gear is what they're worried about trying to recover, but you know, also lots of other things. It's amazing all the stuff that they collect from these very remote islands. It's not local things. These are things that have been floating around for years.
Yeah. Some of it from around the world, the whole other side of the planet. You know.
Right, exactly. In fact, one of the big contributors was the 2011 tsunami off in Japan, right? Which, you know, we hear about how the death toll was, you know, close to 16,000. It was a horrible event. What you don't hear so much about is all the debris that was created. So this giant wave went on to Japan, generated about 20 million tons of debris, and about 5 million tons of that got sucked back out into the ocean and has been circulating around since then. So that's a significant contributor.
Yeah, amazing stuff. And I've read too that, I mean, this stuff does get everywhere. The microplastics particularly end up in all the bottom samples. A recent group went and they sampled from the Arctic all the way down through the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, around Africa and up into the Indian Ocean. And everywhere they went, all their bottom samples had little polyester fibers, little microbeads, at significant concentrations of these things too.
Right. Yes. And so that's really the challenge. You know, as scientists, we are always trying to learn new things and discover new issues. And, you know, so my area of primary study is ocean acidification. You know, and I tell people that I've been studying ocean acidification for 25 years, even though the term has only been around for 10. And what we've seen is this exponential growth. Once it was really recognized as a problem, then a bunch of other researchers start looking into it. we're just at the beginning of that phase now with marine plastics. You know, it's been kind of lingering in the background, and people that, you know, say, oh gosh, all this trash building up on the beach is a problem. But it hasn't really been studied until very recently.
Right. This recent article in The Economist about plastics in the ocean, and they talk about a conference on a call initially, and they maybe got 100 people, and 4 years later they had to cap the conference out because they had 600 scientists registered to talk about it. So, yeah,
exactly. But that's really what's exciting is, you know, you get a kind of a critical mass of people that say, oh, okay, this really is a problem, and then you start to get all these different aspects that we didn't really even appreciate. There was a recent study done by some researchers at the University of Hawaii where they saw that the bacterial populations on these marine plastics is completely different from the bacterial populations on you know, natural particles in the ocean. So what do those bacteria and viruses that are on those plastics do that we don't really understand that yet? Yeah,
but it is actually known, as I understand it, that when plastics get onto the coral reefs, that's very bad for the coral. Those corals tend to get sick, tend to get all kinds of weird diseases start happening to them. Yeah.
Again, it's all those chemicals.
Right.
You know, and any sort of filter feeder, like the corals that are grabbing these particles thinking that they're food, and it plugs up their systems. Oysters, clams, you know, they're all the same. All these filter feeders in particular are really being stressed by all the plastics.
And since some of us like to eat some of those filter feeders, like the oysters and the clams and the mussels, right?
Right.
That means we're now getting some of this back directly. It's being recycled into us.
Exactly. So a lot of people were saying, you know, oh, well, fish, you know, it's collecting in their guts. Well, you cut the guts out, you know, you don't eat the guts. You do on an oyster, you eat the whole thing, and so you're most likely ingesting plastics when you eat oysters.
Yeah.
I'm not saying don't eat oysters, but and actually one of the challenges that we've had in you know, having a recognition of these problems is that there's not been direct evidence of human impacts, you know, human health impacts. But I think that's just coming. You know, it's just that the studies haven't been done yet.
Yeah, I mean, they already know, and it's funny, this article was in The Economist, right? And they discussed the toll of plastics is estimated at $140 billion a year in terms of the harm caused by them and the costs associated with the plastics. Only 10% of that is with the ocean, the marine plastics, but the harm does come in a variety of flavors and a variety of ways.
You get those nets or fishing lines tangled up in the propellers of ships. It costs, you know, a huge amount of money, and not just in repairing that, but in the time lost. You know, think of the tourism industry. That's a big thing here in Hawaii. Who wants to go to a beach that's full of plastic? And
And this stuff, as you were saying, started to show, I mean, it lasts for a long, long time. Now, sooner or later, it does break down, right? I mean,
well, so what happens is, you know, even big pieces of plastic, you know, milk crates and fishing buoys and things, they are very sensitive to the sun, to UV radiation. So anyone that's ever had a plastic bucket or whatever that they left out in the sun, you know, after a couple of years, it breaks down, it gets very brittle. That same thing happens in the ocean. So even the big pieces of plastic break into smaller and smaller pieces. And that's when they become what we call these microplastics and really become a challenge because they look like food. But they don't ever actually go away. I mean, they can last thousands and thousands of years. They just get into tinier particles.
Where they're harder and harder to get rid of. If they all stayed as big chunks, you can get that out of the ocean fairly easily.
Then eventually it'll wash up on a beach, and hopefully we can have a beach cleanup that'll...
But when it's down to millimeter size or below, I mean, yeah, you're never going to really get that out. There's no way.
And it's also hard to control then. You know, at that point, it's just a random piece of colored plastic. You can't tell who manufactured it to go back and try and stop those production of those plastics.
So, I mean, I suppose we have to some extent, you know, rely on the sort of the wondrous power of evolution, right, and figure that sooner or later there will appear in the ocean some sorts of little protists or bacteria or whatever that can actually eat and dissolve plastics and digest them. you
Right,
know.
and that's very likely. There's always
Right.
something that takes advantage of those
Right,
sort
yeah,
of
it's a food
things.
source ultimately.
But you also have to consider, all right, how is that impacting the ecosystem overall? How are those bacteria
Right.
going to interact with the natural bacteria and natural assemblages?
They may have been a tiny percentage before, and they may now grow to being a much larger percentage. Yes, that's going to then.
Right, and then do they then release those toxins out in a different form that maybe is even more toxic too?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's because we're just starting to do these studies. We really don't know the answers to those issues yet.
Right. This is all. Then this is sort of one phase, as it were, of the great geoengineering experiment that humanity is doing with our planet. Right. Without having any real clue about the results or even some of the variables in it. And yet we've been sort of cranking away doing this inadvertently by releasing carbon in the atmosphere and releasing plastics all around. I mean, because of course the plastics are also on the terrestrial environments too. We've got to assume if you took any square meter of ground, probably you're going to find microbeads on it. You're going to find little polyester threads. You're going to find,
Right.
you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a dangerous game we're playing. But I think the tides are beginning to change. I think there's a ray of hope, I think, in the recognition that these plastics are a problem. You know, they are very visible in most places, so it's a visual reminder of how humans are changing the environment. And so as we move towards some of these vegetable-based utensils for eating and plastic bags that aren't really plastic, they're made of vegetable matter that decompose, that I think there are solutions that are out there that don't mean the end of the way we do life and take advantage of these plastics.
Right, we are a sort of endlessly ingenious species. We have a lot of very clever, well-meaning, good-hearted, hard-working people working on these kind of problems, like yourself. And we presumably will find solutions to these. It's interesting in the current political era to see the youth movements now, when the kids finally feel threatened by the shooters in the school and have gotten out and gotten very active. Will there come a day when they're going to recognize and say we're feeling threatened by all the plastics that are
absolutely
overwhelming us now, and we demand that something be done? And
absolutely.
By that time they'll all be of voting age.
That's what it takes. That's what it takes.
Yeah.
And then in the meantime, whatever we can do to try and clean up our environment. There are active beach cleanup activities going on all the time. There's a big one that's the International Coastal Cleanup that organizes people from all around the world to every September to go and clean up the beaches. And
Super. Let's do it. I'll tell you what. I want to ask you one quick question, completely off the wall.
Okay.
If you could have the superpower of either flying or being invisible, which would you choose and why?
Oh, definitely flying. I love to travel, and if I could just fly to anywhere I wanted to go, that's definitely what I do.
Well, thank you, Chris. We are done with another episode of Likable Science here. You have enlightened me and you've enlightened our audience as all my guests do. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you again here.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you, and join us next time on Likable Science.